The shadow in the woods, Jake and his friends, Tom and Eric, had been hunting in the deep forests of Montana for years. The three of them had grown up together, sharing adventures, and this forest felt like home to them. They knew every trail, every hidden valley, and every good spot for hunting. They had never been afraid out here before. But one year, something felt different. It started the moment they arrived. Usually, the forest was full of life, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the distant calls of animals. But this time, it was silent. Not just quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of nature were missing. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the trees. Tom was the first to notice. "Something's weird," he said, adjusting his backpack. "Where are all the animals?" Eric shrugged. "Maybe there's a storm coming or something." Jake wasn't convinced, but he didn't want to scare his friends. "Let's just set up camp. We'll figure it out later." They chose a familiar spot near a stream, where they had camped many times before. As they unpacked their gear, a strange smell filled the air. It was faint at first, but soon it became impossible to ignore. It smelled like something rotting, like old meat left out in the sun too long. Eric gagged. "Ugh, what is that?" Jake frowned. "I don't know. Maybe something died nearby." Tom walked around the campsite, sniffing the air. "It's strongest over here," he said, pointing toward the trees. They decided to ignore it for the time being. They finished setting up camp and built a fire as the sun started to set. That night, as they sat around the fire roasting marshmallows and telling stories, they heard it, a twig snapping just beyond the trees. All three of them froze. "Probably just a deer," Jake said, gripping his rifle. He had seen plenty of deer in this area before. But then, they saw something. A pair of glowing eyes staring at them from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to a deer. Eric quickly grabbed his flashlight and pointed it at the eyes, but as soon as the light hit them, they vanished. Silence. Then, a slow, heavy breathing sound came from the trees. It was deep, almost like a growl, but not quite. Jake stood up. "We should go check it out," he said, but neither Tom nor Eric moved. "Dude, I don't think that's a good idea," Tom whispered. Eric nodded. "Yeah, man. Let's just stay here." Jake hesitated, but the breathing sound suddenly stopped. Whatever it was had gone. They tried to shake it off and went to bed, but none of them slept well. Every time they closed their eyes, they felt like something was watching them. The next morning, they found footprints near their camp, massive, clawed prints unlike anything they had ever seen before. They were too big to belong to a bear, and the shape was all wrong. The prints had long, deep claw marks, as if whatever made them had enormous talons. Tom cursed. "What the hell is that?" Eric bent down to get a closer look. "It was here last night, right next to our tents." A chill ran down Jake's spine. Something had been watching them, and it had come closer than they realized. They decided to keep hunting as planned, but stayed close together. Every now and then, they felt like something was following them. They would hear twigs snapping behind them, but when they turned around, nothing was there. By the afternoon, they had caught nothing. No deer, no rabbits, nothing. It was like all the animals had disappeared from the forest. Jake wiped sweat from his forehead. "This isn't normal. We should head back." Tom and Eric agreed. They hurried back to their campsite, but as they arrived, they froze. Their tents were slashed open. Their supplies were scattered. Something had destroyed their camp. "No way," Tom breathed. "No way." Eric picked up his backpack. "We need to get out of here." They packed what little they could and started walking back toward their truck. But as they moved through the forest, the silence grew heavier. It felt like the trees were closing in around them. Then the breathing sound returned. This time it was closer. Jake gripped his rifle tighter. Run! They ran as fast as they could, crashing through the trees. The heavy breathing followed them. Branches snapped behind them. It was chasing them. Eric tripped, falling hard onto the ground. Help! Jake and Tom grabbed him and pulled him up, just as a shadow moved through the trees beside them. It was huge, too big to be any animal they knew. Finally, they saw the road up ahead. Their truck was just beyond it. They sprinted, their hearts pounding. As they reached the vehicle, Jake threw open the door, and they all jumped inside. Slamming the door shut, he started the engine. The headlights lit up the road, but just before they drove off, they saw it. Standing at the edge of the forest was a tall, dark figure. Its glowing eyes locked onto them. It didn't move. It just watched as they sped away. They didn't stop driving until they reached the nearest town. They told a local man about what had happened. He listened carefully, then nodded. "You met the Watcher," he said. "You're lucky to be alive." Jake, Tom, and Eric never returned to that forest. And to this day, they still wonder what it was that stalked them through the trees. Maybe it was a creature no one had ever seen before. Or maybe it was something much older, something that had always been there, waiting in the dark. The Imitator, the Appalachian Mountains, are beautiful but mysterious. Tall trees stretch for miles, their thick leaves blocking out the sky. The air smells fresh, mixed with the scent of pine and damp earth. These mountains have been home to many hunters and travelers, but they also hold secrets, stories passed down for generations, whispers of things that don't belong. It was in these mountains that a father and his son, Jake and Noah, decided to go on a hunting trip. Jake had grown up hunting with his own father and wanted to pass down the tradition to his son. Noah was excited but a little nervous. This was his first real trip deep into the woods. He had been on short hikes and camped near their home before, but never this far from civilization. The first day went well. They hiked for hours, taking in the sights, listening to birds, and following animal tracks. Jake taught Noah how to read the signs of nature, broken twigs, footprints in the mud, and the way birds went silent when a predator was near. Noah listened carefully, wanting to impress his father. By evening, they found a perfect spot to set up camp. A small clearing near a stream, surrounded by tall oak trees. Jake showed Noah how to build a proper fire and set up their tents. As the sun set, they sat around the fire, cooking their dinner. The warm glow of the flames flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. "See, this isn't so bad, right?" Jake said with a smile. Noah nodded, feeling more confident. "Yeah, it's actually kinda nice." The stars appeared above them, twinkling in the vast darkness. The woods were alive with the sounds of crickets and distant hoots of an owl. Everything felt peaceful. But that peace wouldn't last. That night, Noah woke up suddenly. He wasn't sure why. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and everything was silent, too silent. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. Then he heard it. A voice. A soft, distant voice calling a name. Noah. His breath caught in his throat. It was a woman's voice, gentle but strange. His heart pounded. There were no women out here. Just him and his dad. He turned toward his father's tent. "Dad?" he whispered. Jake stirred and groggily unzipped his tent. "What is it?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Did you hear that?" Noah whispered. Jake listened, but all was quiet now. He sighed and shook his head. "It's just the wind, son. Go back to sleep." Noah didn't feel convinced, but he nodded and crawled back into his sleeping bag, pulling it up to his chin. It took a long time for him to fall asleep again. The next morning, Noah didn't mention the voice. Maybe he had imagined it. They spent the day tracking deer, but something felt different. The forest seemed off. The trees looked darker. The air was heavier. Even Jake seemed more cautious, looking around more than usual. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they set up camp again. This time, the fire felt more like a shield than warmth. They ate quietly, listening to the woods. Then it happened again. Noah. The voice was closer this time, soft, familiar. Noah dropped his plate. His father froze. "That ain't the wind," Jake whispered. A chill ran through Noah. "Then what is it?" Jake didn't answer. He grabbed his rifle and stood up, scanning the trees with his flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but nothing was there. Just trees and shadows. Then they saw it. A figure, just beyond the tree line. At first, it looked like a person, but something was wrong. Its body was still, too still. Then it moved jerky, unnatural movements, like a puppet being pulled by strings. Noah grabbed his father's arm. "Dad." Jake slowly lowered the flashlight. "Pack up," he whispered. They didn't sleep that night. Instead, they sat by the fire, guns close, listening. The voice didn't come again, but the feeling of being watched never left. As soon as dawn broke, they packed their gear and started heading back down the mountain. Halfway down, they met an old hunter, sitting on a fallen log, chewing tobacco. He squinted at them, noticing their pale faces. "You two look like you've seen a ghost," he said, spitting onto the ground. Jake hesitated, then told him everything. The voice, the figure, the way it moved. The old hunter nodded slowly. "That ain't the wind, boy," he said. "That's a mimic." Noah swallowed. "A mimic?" The hunter leaned forward, lowering his voice. "They ain't people. They ain't animals. They just copy. They hear a voice, they repeat it. They see a face, they try to match it. But they never get it right. That's why they move wrong." Jake tightened his grip on his rifle. "What do they want?" The hunter shrugged. "No one knows. Some folks say they lure people in. Others say they just watch." He stood up, stretching. "But I'll tell you this. If you ever hear your own voice calling you from the woods, don't answer." Noah shuddered. He didn't need to be told twice. They never went back to that part of the mountains again. The whistling man, the wind howled through the towering pine trees as a group of hunters set out for a week-long trip deep into the Canadian wilderness. There were 5 of them: Kyle, Jason, Mark, Peter, and Tom. They had been on countless trips together, tracking deer, elk, and the occasional bear. But none of them were prepared for what they would encounter on this particular journey. Kyle was the most experienced tracker among them. He could read the forest like a book. Every snapped twig, every footprint in the dirt, every call of a bird told him a story. The others relied on him to guide them safely through the wild. The first 2 days of the trip went as expected. They set up camp near a river, built a fire, and spent their days hunting. The forest was thick, the air crisp, and the silence deep, only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. At night, they gathered around the fire, telling old stories and laughing over past trips. But on the 3rd night, something strange happened. As they sat around the fire, Jason froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. The group fell silent, listening. At first, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the distant chirping of crickets. Then it came, a slow, deliberate whistle drifting through the trees. It was soft but distinct, weaving through the night air like a ghostly tune. "Probably the wind." Mark shrugged, tossing another log into the fire. "Winds doesn't whistle like that," Kyle muttered, his eyes narrowing as he listened. The whistling continued, circling the camp. It moved from one side to the other, never getting closer, never getting farther. It was too controlled, too intentional. Maybe some other hunters are messing with us? Peter suggested, trying to sound unconcerned. At this hour? In the middle of nowhere? Tom shook his head. Not likely. The whistling went on for nearly an hour before finally fading into silence. No one slept easily that night. The voice in the dark the next day. The group tried to shake off the eerie feeling. They spent the morning hunting and had a successful day, bringing back a large buck. But the unease never quite left them. That night, as they sat around the fire once more, the whistling returned. All right, this is getting old, Jason grumbled, gripping his rifle. Whoever you are, get lost. The whistling stopped. For a few moments, everything was silent. Then, from the darkness, a voice echoed back. Whoever you are, get lost. The words were repeated in Jason's exact tone, the same anger, the same frustration. But it wasn't Jason speaking. It wasn't any of them. A chill ran down their spines. The fire crackled loudly in the silence that followed. No one spoke. No one moved. That wasn't an echo, Peter whispered. That was something else. Kyle stood up, grabbing his flashlight. We need to find out who's out there. Are you crazy? Mark hissed. That's exactly how horror stories start. And what do you suggest? Kyle countered. We ignore it? Pretend it's nothing? They argued for a moment before deciding to stay together and check the perimeter. With rifles in hand and flashlights cutting through the darkness, they searched the surrounding trees. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of movement. Just the cold wind and the looming shadows of the forest. Reluctantly, they returned to camp, their nerves on edge. That night, no one slept well. Kyle stays behind by morning. The group had made a decision. Let's pack up and leave, Jason said. This trip isn't worth whatever's out there. Everyone agreed, except Kyle. You guys can go, but I need to know what's going on here, he insisted. This isn't normal. I've spent years in the woods, and I've never seen or heard anything like this. Kyle, come on, Peter pleaded. This isn't safe. I'll be fine, Kyle assured them. I'll catch up with you in a couple of days. Against their better judgment, they left him behind. Kyle spent the next 2 nights alone. The whistling returned each evening, circling his camp just as before. But now, there were voices too, soft, distant, whispering his name. He tried to follow the sounds, but they always stayed just out of reach. The deeper he went into the forest, the stronger the feeling of being watched grew. Then, on the 3rd night, something changed. The last night Kyle sat by his fire, gripping his rifle tightly. The whistling started again, but this time it was different. Closer, almost inside the camp. Then, footsteps. Not animal footsteps. These were deliberate, human-like steps crunching through the fallen leaves. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. Who's there? He called out, raising his rifle. No answer. Then, a voice. Who's there? Kyle's own voice echoed back at him. But it wasn't an echo. It was something else. Something unnatural. A shadow moved between the trees. Tall. Thin. Its head tilted slightly as it watched him. The firelight barely illuminated its shape, but Kyle could see its lips moving. It was whistling. Kyle aimed his rifle and fired. The shot rang through the forest, but when the smoke cleared, the shadow was gone. The only thing left was silence. Heart pounding, Kyle retreated into his tent, clutching his rifle. He didn't sleep. The discovery days passed. The rest of the group waited for Kyle to return, but he never did. Worried, they contacted authorities, and a search party was sent into the woods. They found his campsite untouched, his belongings still there. but Kyle was missing. Weeks later, they found his body deep in the forest. There were no signs of an animal attack, no wounds, no struggle. The only strange thing? Kyle's lips were curled, as if he were still whistling. The legend grows after that trip. The group never returned to those woods. Stories spread about Kyle's fate, about the whistling man who roamed the forest. Some say it's an old spirit, imitating voices to lure people deeper into the trees. Others believe it's something older, something that was never human to begin with. All they know for sure is this: if you ever hear slow, deliberate whistling in the woods, don't follow it. Don't answer it. Just leave. Because once you hear the whistling man, he never forgets you. The cabin that shouldn't exist, four friends, Jake, Ryan, Mark, and Chris, had been planning this trip for months. They wanted to get away from their busy lives and enjoy nature. They chose the Alaskan wilderness, a place where they could hunt, relax, and escape the stress of work and responsibilities. They packed everything carefully: food, water, warm clothes, sleeping bags, and their hunting gear. They knew that the wilderness could be dangerous, but they were confident in their survival skills. Since the area was too far to drive, they hired a small seaplane to take them to a remote location deep in the forest. It was a place untouched by people, with no roads, no towns, and no cell service. As they stepped onto the dock where their plane was waiting, they met the pilot, an old man named Tom. He had been flying in these parts for years and knew the land well. "Be careful out there," Tom said as they loaded their bags into the plane. "Strange things happen in these woods." The friends chuckled. "Like what?" "Ghosts?" Mark joked. Tom didn't laugh. He just shook his head. "Just be careful." The plane ride was beautiful. Below them, the land stretched endlessly: thick forests, winding rivers, and towering mountains. When they landed on a small lake, Tom helped them unload their gear. "I'll be back in a week," he said. "Same spot. Make sure you're here." He paused and gave them one last look. "And don't go too deep into the forest." The friends waved him off and watched as the plane took off, leaving them completely alone in the wild. A strange discovery. The first day was perfect. They set up camp near a river, built a fire, and cooked their food. The air was crisp, the water clear, and the sky filled with stars. It felt like a dream. The next morning, they split into two groups to hunt. Jake and Ryan went one way, Mark and Chris the other. They planned to meet back at camp by sunset. As Jake and Ryan walked through the dense trees, something felt off. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. Ryan frowned. "Do you feel like we're being watched?" Jake shrugged. "Probably just animals. We're in their home." But Ryan couldn't shake the feeling. Then, just as the sun began to dip, they saw it: a cabin hidden among the trees. It looked abandoned. The wood was old and cracked, vines creeping up the walls. The windows were dusty, the front door slightly open. It was strange because there was no sign of human life anywhere around it. "This isn't on the map," Ryan said, checking his GPS. "That doesn't make sense," Jake muttered. They stepped closer, curiosity getting the best of them. The door creaked as they pushed it open. Inside, dust filled the air. Old furniture sat untouched, covered in cobwebs. Symbols were carved into the walls: circles, lines, strange shapes they didn't recognize. Ryan shivered. "This place is creepy. Maybe we should leave." Before they could decide, they heard voices outside. It was Mark and Chris. They had also found the cabin while tracking a deer. Since it was getting dark, they all agreed to stay the night. The night of whispers. As the night settled in, the wind outside picked up, rattling the windows. They started a small fire in the fireplace, hoping to keep warm. Mark pointed at the symbols on the wall. Do you think these mean something? Probably just old carvings, Jake said, though he wasn't sure. As they tried to sleep, strange noises filled the night. At first, they thought it was just the wind. Then Chris sat up suddenly. Did you hear that? They all listened. There it was, whispers. Soft, distant, impossible to understand. Then came the scratching at the windows, slow and deliberate, like something was trying to get in. Jake grabbed his rifle and moved toward the window. He looked outside but saw nothing, just darkness and swaying trees. Maybe it's an animal, Mark suggested, but he didn't sound confident. They tried to ignore it and sleep, but the noises continued. Then, in the middle of the night, Ryan gasped, Guys, the door is open. They all sat up, staring at the cabin door. It was slightly ajar, swinging gently as if someone or something had pushed it open. Chris jumped up and slammed it shut, locking it with an old wooden bar. We're leaving first thing in the morning. No one disagreed. The impossible footprints morning finally came. They packed their things quickly, eager to leave. But when they stepped outside, they froze. There were no footprints in the snow leading to the cabin. They had walked through thick snow the night before, and their tracks should have been there. But there was nothing, not their footprints, not even animal tracks. It was as if they had simply appeared in the cabin without ever walking there. Panic set in. This isn't possible, Jake whispered. Ryan's face was pale. We need to go. Now. They hurried back toward their camp, but something felt different. The forest seemed darker, quieter. Hours passed, but they couldn't find their way back. We should have reached it by now, Chris said, checking the GPS. This doesn't make sense. Then they heard it again, the whispers. This time, they were louder, coming from all around them. The friends pressed together, gripping their weapons. Suddenly, Mark pointed ahead. Look! Through the trees, the cabin stood in front of them again. But that was impossible. They had been walking away from it. No, Jake said, shaking his head. We left this place. They turned and ran, pushing through the thick trees, desperate to escape. The whispers followed, growing louder, almost angry. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The friends burst out of the woods onto the riverbank, right where their camp had been. The guide's warning, they didn't stop to question how they had found their way back. They packed their things as fast as they could and used their radio to call the seaplane pilot. When Tom arrived, he took one look at them and frowned. What happened? They told him everything, the cabin, the whispers, the missing footprints. Tom's face darkened. Where exactly did you see this cabin? They pointed at their map. Tom shook his head. That's not possible. There's no cabin there. Never has been. The friends were silent, chills running down their spines. As they boarded the plane, they looked back at the forest. It was quiet, still, as if nothing had happened. But deep in their hearts, they knew the truth. There was something in those woods, and it had been watching them all along. The eyes in the trees, Sam was a hunter. He had been hunting for years, ever since he was a teenager. He loved the quiet of the forest, the thrill of tracking animals, and the satisfaction of a good hunt. Most of all, he loved doing it alone. Being out in the wild by himself made him feel free. One day, he decided to challenge himself by hunting in a remote part of the Rocky Mountains. It was a place he had never been before, deep in the wilderness. He had heard stories about the area. Some people said it was cursed. Others said it was haunted. But Sam didn't believe in those things. He believed in skill, patience, and the power of nature. He packed his gear carefully. His rifle was cleaned and loaded. His backpack was filled with supplies, and he had enough food and water for a few days. He also carried a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a knife. He was ready for anything, or so he thought. The first day of the hunt was normal. The air was crisp and cold. The trees stretched high above him, and the ground was covered in fallen leaves. He followed animal tracks, listening carefully to the sounds of the forest. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and a distant stream flowed steadily. It was peaceful. But as the sun started to set, things began to feel different. At first, it was just a strange feeling, the kind that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He felt like he was being watched. He turned around quickly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the same quiet forest. He shook his head, telling himself it was just his imagination. Then he heard it, a twig snapping in the distance. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It sounded deliberate, like a footstep. He gripped his rifle tighter and looked around. Still, nothing. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. He decided to set up camp for the night. He found a small clearing, built a fire, and set up his tent. He ate a quick meal, keeping his rifle close. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, but he told himself it was just nerves. He was in an unfamiliar place, alone in the dark. Of course, he'd feel uneasy. As he lay in his tent, trying to sleep, he heard something. A soft rustling sound, like leaves being disturbed. He held his breath, listening. Then, another twig snapped. It was close. Too close. He reached for his flashlight and rifle, slowly unzipping the tent. He shined the light outside. Nothing. The trees stood tall, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. The fire crackled softly, but there was nothing there. No sign of movement. No tracks in the dirt. Just the same eerie silence. He stayed awake for hours, listening. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and he fell asleep. The next morning, he packed up his camp and continued his hunt. He tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. He had spent years in the wild. He knew what animals sounded like. He told himself it was just paranoia. But as he moved deeper into the forest, the feeling grew stronger. Then he saw them. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. High up in the trees, among the branches, he saw something, tiny glowing spots. He squinted, trying to see clearly. They were eyes, dozens of them, staring down at him. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. His heart pounded. He raised his rifle, pointing it toward the eyes, but they didn't react. No sound, no movement, just silence. He took a step back, then another. The eyes stayed fixed on him. His breathing grew heavy. He had seen plenty of animals in the wild, but nothing like this. What kind of creatures could sit so still, so high up, watching him like that? A part of him wanted to run, but he knew better. Running in the wild was dangerous. He forced himself to stay calm, to think. He raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The loud bang echoed through the trees. The eyes didn't flinch. His stomach twisted. Every instinct told him to leave. He turned and started walking back the way he came. As he moved, the eyes began disappearing. One by one, they blinked out of sight, vanishing into the darkness of the trees. But he didn't hear any movement. No rustling, no branches breaking, just silence. By the time he reached his camp, he was shaking. He packed up as fast as he could, his hands fumbling with the straps of his backpack. He didn't care about the hunt anymore. He just wanted to leave. As he reached his truck, relief washed over him. He threw his gear in the back and climbed into the driver's seat. But just as he turned the key, he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps behind him. Every muscle in his body tensed. He gripped the steering wheel, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't turn around. He didn't want to see what was there. Instead, he floored the gas pedal. The truck roared to life, kicking up dirt as it sped down the narrow forest road. He didn't stop, not until he reached a town miles away. Even now, years later, he refuses to go back. When people ask him what happened, he only says one thing: whatever was in those trees wasn't meant to be seen.